Good evening, everyone. And yeah, thanks very much for making the time to attend this session. I'm hoping that this is going to be useful to you, and I look forward to comments and any feedback or actually just any discussion around the topic. It's something that I've been working with for a long while in terms of my area of interest. I'm a speech therapist and audiologist. I hold a position at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, and I'm also working in Auckland in New Zealand, hence the reference to across the globe. So there's the title of my presentation coming up, and you need to just maybe let me know, Elma, if it actually is visible, because I am not familiar with Teams. Is that there?
Yes, it's there. We can, but now, yeah, there we go.
Is that fine? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so so it's basically voice and communication and gender affirming healthcare that I'm going to be talking about. And just by way of introduction, maybe for those of you who are on the call now, again, I'm not familiar with Teams, but I'm pretty sure the chat works. So if you could just pop your name and your profession in the chat, just so that I can get an idea of who I'm speaking to.
Oh, and actually your registration number as well for CPD points.
And while you're doing that, while you're putting your details in the chat, who you are and what your profession is, perhaps maybe you could also just feel free during the presentation to unmute, ask questions as I go along. I'm fine, Alma, I hope you're okay with that. I'm fine with questions being asked while the presentation is going, or comments or anything like that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I will watch and see if people put up their hands, because you won't be able to see hands while you are presenting.
Do I get to see the chat, Alma?
Not while you're presenting.
Okay, so I'll just go chat, and then I'll maybe when we open for discussion, I can chat some more and find out who people are. Okay, so yeah, so that's who I am. I'm a speech therapist and audiologist, and I'm also a founding board member of Path SA. So I'm really interested in looking at how this wonderful organization engages issues like voice and communication in gender affirming healthcare. These are the learning outcomes for the session. I'm particularly interested in looking at how specifically speech therapy offers what I would consider acceptable voice and communication services for people who are trans and gender diverse. And then in this talk here, I'm hoping that you can maybe engage that as a topic of interest because of the nature of the patient to practitioner ratio in South Africa for a profession like speech therapy. And I'm also going to share a little bit around assessment and how it is that a speech therapist may do an assessment and what are some of the methods we use, just to sort of share the broad, generally acceptable guidelines or practices that occur. And they've certainly changed over the years. I think I mentioned earlier, I've been working in the field for almost 3 decades now. And it's shifted hugely. So there's lots of interesting changes in the way things have happened. And then finally, looking at management methods. So once we've identified what the issues are, how do we address it? So let me just get straight into who we are a little bit. So again, this is why I wanted to know who I was talking to, and I can't see anyone right now, but I'll just share with you a little bit. If this is redundant, forgive me. But who it is we are as a profession. So speech therapists are registered with the Health Professions Council in South Africa, of course. And these areas of practice that you see on the screen are all of the things that we work with, ranging from speech, that says delays and disorders, and that terminology is being used. So it's not something I particularly share, but there it is. And so it's around working with people regarding their speech, language, voice, swallowing and feeding issues, as well as cognitive communication issues. So there's a whole span of areas that we work in. And while I'm going to be focusing more on voice and resonance, I want to cross-reference some of these other areas in the talk this evening. So with regards to the way in which speech and language therapy address voice, and you notice in the title of my presentation, I was careful to put in voice and communication, because that's often the second bit is often something that we don't pay enough attention to in looking at transgender or gender gender affirming healthcare issues regarding voice. And so the main focus of what we would do is look at when working with people who use non-habitual voice production. So especially when the target is either toward masculinization, feminization, or even neutralization of their voices. One of the key things that strikes me as important, is something that we need to focus on, is safety of the voice. So in other words, the larynx itself and how it operates in this whole process. And then, of course, we would look toward presentation, and this means including but not exclusively physical presentation, but a whole range of other patterns of presentation regarding gender congruency. And then the key thing is, besides safety, it's also making sure that we prevent or minimize any risk of damage to the voice. And on the right-hand side, I've got this down as something for us to consider, because oftentimes these are issues we don't foreground or may not notice when working with voice in this field. But notice that there may be several issues associated with either the surgical and or medical interventions that may impact on the person's ability to produce voice, to communicate, etc. And so what I've got listed there are some of the more common things that I've worked with. For example, problems associated with tracheal shave surgeries, just the impact of voice. So issues regarding gastroesophageal reflux and how reflux may impair the acidic volume of that reflux may over time impair the voice and what the voice can do. And then associated with that, just to remember that people who are trans may also have other co-occurring issues. So, for example, having a stroke or person with cerebral palsy, etc., may experience things like muscle weakness, may experience discoordination. So dysarthria and apraxias are part of also the whole scheme of things, perhaps, okay? It's not necessary, so I just need to make clear that I'm not saying it is part of it, but it may also be a part of a person's life. And then, of course, things like vocal fold paralysis. I've also come across a fair number of people who have neurodiversities, of varying cognitive abilities, etc. So in short, besides focusing on voice and communication, there may be issues that we need to look at regarding speech, language, fluency, hearing, amongst a whole range of other factors that impact on a person's ability to communicate. And so really, this is what a speech and language therapist does in terms of this field of practice, is looking at supporting gender identity and expression. And the main thing, and of course, as Alma said, that we're part of a team, is to look at how I, as a speech therapist, work with people in terms of developing their voice and communication, so that there's congruency, or there's a better gender or authentic expression of self. And as we all know, just working in the field, that this sort of work would definitely impact on reducing gender dysphoria, looking at improving mental health and the quality of life. And so some of what the work of a speech and language therapist has been in the field is looking at wellness and sort of general health issues as well. And yeah, we work across the lifespan, so it could be very early, with young children through pubertal stages, including those into adulthood. So it's not exclusively only with people in their later stages of development or their later years. So that's really the key thing I'd like to explore a bit more in this talk. And yeah, just coming back to the learning outcomes, those are the three core areas that I'm going to be looking at what it is to develop an acceptable voice and communication service, and then of course looking at the assessments and then the management. So I'm going to dip a little bit now into what it means to have or develop a generally acceptable voice and communication service. And for me, these are the factors that we need to consider. So, and some of these factors I would never have considered 2 decades ago, possibly, or just when I first started working in the field, like I said, about 3 decades ago, because I would have thought it's more just about let's fix the voice and then off you go. but these issues are, for me, now more critical than ever in terms of the kind of service that we offer as a profession and how we fit into gender affirmation just broadly. So critically to the whole thing is the fact that we do work interprofessionally. So the model of working one-on-one, individualized, sort of medicalized model of healthcare is something that is not generally seen as a good way of working. So, and specifically here, I'm making reference to interprofessional versus multidisciplinary or any other model of healthcare. So this literally means negotiating with your colleagues, literally in a team, sitting around the same person, talking about how it is we can develop and deliver effective healthcare services around voice and communication. Collaboration is critical. I teach this course to a set of undergraduate students currently, and just yesterday, actually, we had a conversation around, so one of the students was working with a client and said how uncomfortable she felt with revealing herself, with being human, with having to become a person because her client was not sick. And I said, so what's that feel like? Because generally the way in which speech therapists operate, and this is typical for most of healthcare professionals, I think, is that we hang on to the sick trope. And so we use this strongly to medicalize everything we do. The person is referred to as the patient, or even like I mentioned now, the client, which is a sort of a gentle pseudonym for the same consumerist reference to a patient and healthcare model. And so it becomes slightly different when there's a fair amount of not just negotiation of service, but of identity between the speech therapist and the person they're working with. So that kind of collaboration around services and personhood and identity is something that I think is new to many of our professions and has been new for the last maybe few decades, around how we reveal our identities in this process, both ways. And then this whole notion of being person-centered, which I think many people roll their eyes backwards when they see this, but it's certainly something that across healthcare is needing development. Is literally how do we position the person, the human, in the center of this whole process? And I'm looking forward to some of your comments around how you might do this in your own work as well. And then the last two here kind of interlink in a way, but they are certainly separate. Cultural diversity, and here what I mean by cultural diversity is the culture of identity through not just being trans only, and as many trans activists have pointed out, that is one identity, and certainly foregrounded in our relationship when we interface people who are trans in the sort of healthcare moment. But it certainly intersects with being a parent, with being a child, with being a color, with being an age, with being whatever. There's a whole variety of intersectional identities that people are negotiating through being trans. And of course, with voice and communication, for me, all of those things are critical. That is exactly what communication is about. And then, of course, the final thing here, and this is something that I'm pretty passionate about, is the notion of accessibility of services, not just physical accessibility, but other. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So what does accessibility mean in terms of speech therapy in the country? A few years ago, we did this paper looking at who we are as a profession demographically and where we are located. And there's a lot of little numbers on this graph, but I thought it was a nice, pretty colorful one, so I put it up on the slides. But basically, we're very much an independent, private-based service in the country. There's more people in the private sector than there are in the public sector. And immediately that'll tell you a bit about the way in which, about who accesses our services in terms of race, class, etc. And mostly, incidentally, so if there are people on the call from Joburg, you're in good company. There's lots of speech therapists in Joburg, 42.6% of them. Most of us are female, most of us are white, most of us are urban-based, middle-class, English or Afrikaans-speaking speech therapists. So that's the history of the profession, actually, which hasn't shifted humongously since the 1930s in that way, in terms of the profile of who we are. So our services have replicated broadly at the country level, where healthcare is, okay, and specifically within the rehabilitation professions or within professions like speech therapy and so forth. This has been certainly an issue around, like I mentioned in the first point there, around who is able to access our service. So the physical access point of view, it's going to be pretty hard for someone who lives in, say, a rural Black African area in South Africa to access our services, because either there's just nothing, or they're going to have to travel a long way to get to us. So that's just something that positions accessibility of speech and language therapy services to this population broadly. But more specifically, some of the key things here, it's not just about affordability or accessibility. It's also, and yes, affordability is the issue, of course, but also, do we offer a meaningful service? Do we offer services that are appropriate to people? So if you just look at the cultural and linguistic profile, which, by the way, is fairly hard to gather through our database at the Health Professions Council, but that's the statement I made in the previous slide was based on the study we used other proxy indicators for. In terms of looking at who we are and who we serve, we're not entirely sure. I'm going to put this out there based on the fact that my experience of working in the field, is I'm going to say that a lot of what we offer may not be sought by people. So there may not even be an internal demand for speech and language therapy services, despite our claim to have a need. That people have a need for our services. Whether we're trans-friendly or not is another story. Certainly across all of the university education programs and the CPD offerings that are in the country, I'm not quite sure how many, and I've done, Alma's been part of a few of these presentations. We've done a fair amount of training across the country and through these online forums. And I can count on the one hand the number of speech therapists that have been there, usually they're recurring. And so in terms of looking at the service in and of itself as being trans-friendly, undergraduate training is not hugely focused on issues of looking at transgender or gender affirmation healthcare, specifically within voice and communication. And certainly it's not part of an ongoing or professional development focus. And then there's another thing around who we called. So the fact that we are referred to as therapists in most countries around the world, actually the term that's used in, say, North America and in Australia is speech and language pathologist, which in and of itself tells you a little bit about the whole focus. So in fact, if you look through the years of our training, etc., we taught to focus on disability, on deficit, on what's wrong with a person. And so there's a strong focus on how to help and heal and rehabilitate within that kind of paradigm of working with people. And so, yeah, so I think the key thing that I'm pointing out by looking at all of these issues around our services is the fact that we shouldn't be too surprised when people may not seek our services. But especially if you consider our knowledge base, or what I would refer to, and I know Alma might giggle at this word, but our epistemology here around our worldviews and whether we're welcoming enough, whether as a service, as a profession, as an entity out there in the healthcare field, are we actually welcoming enough to people who are trans through our services? So I just wanted to position all these big, broad issues in terms of who we are and what we do, and say that within that still, I think we can offer something of value. So what is it that we do? There's a whole range of things, and I'm going to start off by talking about assessment areas and methods. But I think before I get on to this, if there's anyone that would want to maybe add a comment or questions or anything, it's a bit disconcerting. All I see is a screen with my slides, and I can't even see if you are there or not. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, Alma, if there's anyone that's got their hand up, maybe just let me know while I take a sip of coffee. There's a chance to drink some coffee. Okay. So yeah, so in terms of the broad assessment and methods that we engage, mainly we're considering all those things that are listed in the slide here. So those 6 areas around gender, identity, expression, client goals, okay, what is it that the person wants? And then not just what they want, but what it is that is possible within their voice and communication parameters. So there are certain anatomical, physiological restrictions, in as much as that there are anatomical and physiological possibilities of change. We also look not just at the body, but we look at beyond it. So dipping into the person's social communication environment. So what about the way in which they communicate, who they need to communicate with, etc. Do we need to know through an assessment of their needs, etc. And then aspects to do with their gender affirmation, specifically medication, and argue medical and surgical history is actually important, so that it allows us to understand the parameters within which we are going to be designing the services together. At the next slide. Yeah. And yeah, just by way of introduction, I wanted to talk a little bit about this amazing book. If you haven't read this yet, I'm going to ask you to please have a look, a read. It's written beautifully. And it's called Avatar, as you can see. It's written by Thomas Page McBee. And it's subtitled A True Story About What Makes a Man. And there's a lovely excerpt from here. This is a bit of a excerpt that was based on a review of a book, but it's the one that I thought I could reproduce because it's out in the public domain. And it talks. It's essentially a feminist analysis of voice and communication and gender identity. And so the extract I think I'm going to ask you to consider here is this. And I'll read it out with you, so it gives me, because I can't deal with silence. I was a tomboy kid, a swaggering teen steeped in queer culture, then a masculine adult. I dated women, and my ex and I were once held at gunpoint by a man who went on to target 2 other straight couples, shooting the men. That night, my voice, high, sharp, and immediate tell saved me. When I spoke, something clicked in the gunman's eyes, and he immediately let us go. But my voice also made me invisible. I was frequently interrupted and talked over, especially by men and especially at work. I had to fight harder to make a point. Early in my professional life, I was sometimes simply squeezed into silence. I love this quote for whatever it made you think about right now by reading it. And I'd like you to reflect in that and the politics of gender and its interaction specifically with voice, and how voice and communication here is foregrounded as critical to the mediation of identity here. And then there's another interesting little video shot that I'm going to share of something that happened, I think it was about 2018. I forget the exact year right now, but it was a #MeToo protest march. It was an activist, it's about, basically a feminist activist who were raising awareness of a range of issues. And this young trans woman was part of this and joined it. You can see on the right side, this is her banner as a trans woman, our woman, is what was said. And there was an interesting interaction that happened here. And I'd like you to pay attention to what she says about her voice and others' perceptions of voice. But importantly, what I'd like for you to think about is that these are feminists, these are activists, political activists who are foregrounding gender. And yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on how, again, voice mediates identity. So listen to this.
Did you ask them to remove their signs?
Can you remove your sign?
Shut the
I think maybe we can.
Yeah, that's my face. Yeah, that's what the voice that I was born with. I sound like a man. You think you've got like a little voice?
You mean the words that you're saying?
You don't know, so shut up.
So some strong words there. It's very interesting perceptions that have been portrayed between both the protesters and this young woman, looking at how voice, or what voice represents in terms of identity and socialized experience, as one of the protesters barked back at this young woman. So I'd like for you to think about these bigger, broader social, political issues, and specifically why I selected those 2 things is because it's central to voice and communication. And I can't argue this point greater than what I've just done with these 2 excerpts. And I can tell you there's loads more around there that foreground voice and communication as central to identity in this way. And so to bringing it back to the kind of thing we look at assessment, everything I would do, it always remembers this bigger picture here. And so when looking at voice assessment, I want to foreground that the work that we would do is really not a therapy approached sort of perspective. It's looking at best, I'd say it's a modification type of therapy. And a speech therapist, because we in South Africa and generally across the world, we are the people who are considered experts in voice care. Then we would obviously focus on the laryngeal mechanism, vocal health, vocal hygiene principles come into this quite a bit. And we will work closely with the medical team. So we don't forget that we are part of a bigger team, like I mentioned earlier on. And specifically, we may work closely with ENTs, depending on the nature of the services that we're delivering and who else might be involved. There's a whole host of others that, of course, we would work with, right? In terms of developing focus in our assessment, I think a large part of what we do is actually focus on whether we're working with a difference or disorder, and I'd love to know your comments around that when we have the discussion. But importantly, our work is, because of our training, focused also, not exclusively, but also looking at the safety, the health of the vocal mechanism, looking at the vocal folds, looking at how the larynx itself is engaging the voice that we wanting to develop. And so vocal health and well-being is really foregrounded in this quite a bit. More specifically, in terms of the areas that we would assess, these are the very broad things that we would look at. So what do we look at? We look at pitch and just a couple of wee pointers there around just things around how we might value or understand different pitch ranges. So looking at a cis male pitch range, we look at establishing or identifying cis male as 100 to 140 hertz, so pretty low pitch. And then gender neutrality between 145 to 170 hertz, and then a cis female range between 180 and 220, so higher. Interacting very closely, and arguably this is something that I think I put my money down on, is working with the residents is critical. And so we need to have a huge understanding, a very detailed knowledge of a person's voice in terms of their resonance and their resonant qualities. So we will look at things like how the vocal tract, the filter function, which is what resonance is, of the vocal tract on the sound wave. So the entire upper body, actually head, neck, chest, the whole lot, looking at how sound filters through all of these other aspects of the person's ability to use their voice. And then linked very closely with that would be, and this is linked to the intersection between pitch and resonance here, we'd evaluate a person's natural speaking fundamental frequency. We'd need to specify at what level, what fundamental frequency the person is able to use their voice naturally in the assessment that we do. Of course, we look at range, because we don't all talk in a monotonous voice, although some of us do our best to do that, especially when you're nervous. But there are, there's a range of pitch and loudness levels we engage in when we use our voice. So we look to see what's the intonational variability that the person has. And then we would look at other aspects of rate, the vocal rate, speech rate, etc. The key thing that I am going to harp on constantly here is about vocal hygiene. So looking at both the current use of voice and whether there's any risks that the person is putting their voice at. So are they using their voice in a way that is risky, where it's damaging to the voice? And we also want to look at preventing any further damage in the work that we do. Okay, and so there's some of the critical things here that often, not often, but fairly often enough to notice that we look at are things like adductor spasmodic dysphonia, so the vocal folds coming together and the kind of spasms that may occur as a result of misuse of voice. And then, of course, other things, so physical manifestations of vocal abuse, vocal nodules that lead to other things, of course. So there's a whole range of issues that we look at when assessing voice. So this is the what we would look at. It's going to go a little bit more into, the big point here is that, of course, all of these factors are mediated by critical notions of age. So age is because of age and senescence, so aging and point of age when we intervene, we'd have to take into account, for example, a puberty or an older vocal mechanism. We need to take into account culture. And so what people would consider soft or loud voices, intersecting with gender is something that differs by people. So there's a whole range of other factors here that impact on voice, which I'm not going to go too much into detail with, but I'm sure the point has been made. So specifically with all of what I just said, so what are some of the methods we use? here is just a very broad overview, and it's just a splurge of the objective and the subjective methodologies that we would engage. And very broadly, just to begin an assessment, we would look at the medical status of the person. So what's happening right now in terms of their surgical procedures that are scheduled or have occurred, what hormonal therapies are they on, what state of just medical issues do we need to be aware of at all regarding especially their respiratory mechanisms or anything else to do that intersects with voice itself. And then this questionnaire is not my own title, but it's something that the field has inherited. It's been around for a while, and transsexual voice questionnaire has been used quite a bit in, and I know that's a contested term, but that's the actual name that is there right now. But it's a self-reporting method. It's a tool that looks at people jotting or taking note of their own perceptions of their voice. And then in addition to that, there's the whole host of other objective and subjective methods that we would look at. And these methods center around those 4 areas that are listed there regarding vocal characteristics, resonance and articulation, language and articulation, and nonverbal communication. So just to be making the point again that yes, it is voice, but it's voice and communication. And so these other things are also critical to the assessment. Across both subjective and objective dimensions of what we would do, there's a whole host of tools that we may use regarding how we measure someone's fundamental frequency, how we calculate their pitch range, their intonation, their vocal qualities, their dynamic range, the shifts that they make, and the ability to sustain the voice across a period of time. So looking at their maximum phonation time. So we measure these things and we get, there's nothing like a little figure to work with. So we usually have calculated all kinds of figures that we target or use as goals to shape-shift the way we would work with someone in their voice and communication. And then at a subjective level, and this is something I'm still going to argue for me as a practitioner is probably far more important than some of the objective measures that we have, because of the fact that it gets closer to the experience that a person has of using voice and communication and what it is that they want to do and how they want to, where they want to sort of how they want to perceive and present their voice. So something like the CAPE-V, which is a consensus auditory perceptual evaluation of voice, is commonly used in my area of work. So I work across both, incidentally, people with dysphagia or swallowing disabilities and voice challenges. And so we tend to use a fair amount of instrumental, objective and subjective measures in both these areas. With regards to voice, this is a subjective but very widely used tool, which really zones in on the issues that would give us really important information to take a person through this journey. So we look at quality, we look at strain, we look at pitch, we look at volume. That's a whole range of things that are based on this CAPE-V evaluation. And then all other issues to do with alignment, so the gender identity alignment and voice and communication, this respiration measures, the measures of a person's actual respiratory abilities, so their sort of total volume, their ability to hold and use their breath support for voice. And then are people using any compensatory or compensation strategies to make their voice the way they want it to be? Some of these compensations, and the word compensation is a clue there to tell you a bit about the way that they're usually not helpful in the long term. So they may give somebody a short-term strategy, a quick resolution to producing a voice that seems to be the voice that they're targeting, but it may be unhealthy. It may result in misuse of vocal abuse. So we assess compensatory patterns and what is it that they're doing that may actually impact or harm their voice a bit more. And so in that way, we're looking at a whole range of tension sites, muscular tension, ranging from the laryngeal musculature through to what I refer to, or what's being referred to as the strap muscles, so around the whole laryngeal mechanism itself, around the head and neck, the chest, the back, etc. and looking at how voice, when produced in that way, relies on all of these other muscular supports. Resonance, intonation, articulation, again, are all listed here as part of what we would evaluate through the subjective dimension, and of course rate. So if you just consider what's in the slide here, it's a wide area of voice and communication aspects that we would look at. And so going further just a little bit, I thought I'd just could give a little example of some of the things that we might want to consider. So for example, if we're looking at female voice development, we're looking at maybe developing targets, goals that look at increasing someone's fundamental frequency. We might, with a female client, look at targeting either gender neutral or higher pitch. We would look at working toward a safe level of voice production. We check to see if this fundamental frequency is actually what the person wants. Okay, does it match with their own perception of their voice and communication? And we look to see if any of these changes affect resonance, affect appearance. So it may be that the voice is produced at the level that is perceived as desirable. But if there's a whole lot of muscle strain, say in the head and neck region, and there's a whole lot of veins popping about and muscle tension around here, then it might alter the appearance of a person. Things like breathy voice quality and looking at vocal characteristics like vocal fry, that kind of thing, may also be something to target, to eliminate, essentially. Inflections, so we might want to work at creating a whole range of vocal inflections, more upward, more inflections and upward or sort of sounding voices. We'd work with altering volume, either moving it to a lower level, depending again on the person's perception. We'd look at their fundamental frequency, look at resonance, look at changing how their resonant features are perceived, and kind of looking at the interaction of resonance and voice here. So I just put this on the slide as an example of some of the things that we might want to negotiate with the person when engaging them in therapy. Yeah, I just thought I'd pop this in here about vocal surgery for the surgeons in the house. And I know that the surgeons that certainly are part of Part SA would agree with this in general. So oftentimes people will pop over to an ENT and go, change my voice. I want it to sound the way I want it to sound. And generally, laryngeal surgery is not routinely offered. And why that's the case is because of the fact that if you're looking firstly at masculinization, testosterone will actually have an effect on one's vocal folds. It increases the mass of the vocal folds, which then develops the person's voice into a lower pitch. Mostly this is deemed desirable by people who are under masculinization therapies, etc. However, that's still an area of debate because many people are not satisfied with the level of masculinization, so seek further assistance with this. But it's this that we're worried about, that most people think surgery might be the solution for. We were looking at feminization. Estrogen does little, virtually nothing, and I'm going to argue, put my money down on this one here, that I have yet to see someone who's been on estrogen where there's been a change in the voice toward the desired feminization. And so when you're looking at vocal cord surgery, is it going to work or not? Is it something that's desirable? The jury is out, okay? And I'd love to see if there's any sort of research papers looking at whether this is something that will be used. There have been a few papers, so it's not like there's no evidence, but by and large, feminization will have to rely, for a voice, has to rely on other things. And the other things would be speech therapist interventions or other voice specialists. And I'll tell you a bit more about that when we have a discussion on who else works with voice, of course, and you would know that the person themselves engages a lot of intervention. So looking at management methods, what are some of the things that we would work on? Again, just a quick reference here to all of the issues we'd focus on. So voice characteristics, resonance, language, nonverbal communication, and the little note that I have there about apps. Apps are amazing. So thanks to technology, we've got a whole range of tools that people can use to either pitch match their voices, to look at biofeedback, even to gauge against norms of loudness levels, vocal characteristics, and a whole range of other things besides pitch. And of course, technology besides apps means that people have, especially in this day and age, and here I'm talking about the privileged few people in the world that do have access. And don't forget that South Africa's got a huge digital divide. So for those people who do have ready access to the internet, can get a whole range of self-training videos and connect with people who are working with each other. And so that bigger, broader background of how people engage their voice in that using technology, using apps, etc., is something certainly we would work with because it happens. And speech therapists, of course, are not the only people that work with voice. But one of the key things that I want to distinguish between, say, a vocal coach or someone who may not have a sufficient medical training to look at the vocal health, is that that's the first thing I would work out is, are you doing anything to damage your voice? Are you going to hurt yourself? And so vocal health first, then voice change is what I would want to promote. So that's really critical for the way in which we work with voice. And Alma, you must give me a time check. I think I've got a few minutes left.
Yeah, you can keep going, Mershen.
Okay, cool. And yeah, so I'm just going to go into some of the critical things about vocal health that we would focus on. So of course, that terrible thing called smoking, which no one should be doing. Drinking, of course, also falls in that category. And so there's a whole range of vocal health behaviors and things that we would focus on as part of establishing a clean voice, a voice that is relatively risk-free. Some of the phonotrauma areas that we would definitely focus on right at the beginning is looking at the laryngeal tension, fatigue, vocal fold strain. Is the person doing any of this that they shouldn't be doing to produce voice? And because voice and breathing go hand in hand, air or your respiration is the fuel for voice, without which you can't make voice, right? And so if there's something amiss with their use of their breaths, their air, or even their breathing system itself, then we need to work with that and fix that as well. And then looking at the fact that a well-lubricated, well-hydrated vocal system is what's necessary. So these are some of the key things we focus on, those gray boxes on the right-hand side of your screen when we're looking at vocal health. And this is just a very broad overview, and again, this is a whirlwind tour of some of the things that we would do. But just as a broad overview of, say, exercises that we might engage, yes, we will work with exercises that look at increasing flexibility, vocal flexibility and variability. Of course, we'd look at strength. We'd look at, so if you just look at some of those, what's listed under strategies, actually all the things that are under strategies are the strategies. We would look at, in a typical session, one would always begin with things like a warm-up. So you like get a nasal E or do a pitch match in an F note. They do a range of vocal stretches, vocal contracting, exercises around gliding, for example. And then we might do something around isometric versus isotonic strength development, where you'd look at musical notes, again, pitch matching. So we're not doing voice training, singing, but we're certainly using a fair number of those principles that allow for the voice to be in a usable, maximally usable state when we're working with someone. And then other issues that we might want to think about. So, and again, you may have heard me say a little while ago that I put my money down on resonance and resonance in its interaction with voice when looking at transgender voice development. And here's an example of how I might focus this. So, for example, I'd look at producing voice with forward resonatory focus and as little vocal effort as possible. So in other words, the voice that is produced is not painful to make. It doesn't hurt over time. And so we might do things like engage in strategies like chanting or humming, etc., which is a low energy sort of voice production task, and then build that more and how the voice has been produced at that level into sentences, into conversation, and then specifically looking at how we might increase control, change flexibility of that voice, and critically endurance. So ensuring that that voice in that desired way can be used for a longer period, making sure that there's reduced tension and vocal clarity. So it's, these are some of the areas of intervention that we might target. And just a bit more around resonance and articulation here, and I'm not going to go through all these slides in detail. I am just aware of the time. But one of the key things here is looking at how we might, for example, change the point of resonance, so where it occurs in the body, in the head and neck and chest area, and shift the resonance so that there's either an increase in resonance or mostly, if you're looking at feminization, a decrease in resonance. And work with shifting resonance to match vocal output. Yeah, this is, for me, the one aspect that especially younger therapists getting involved in voice therapy tend to not focus on as much. And one of the things that I'm passionate about promoting is beyond the voice, beyond looking at the production, alteration of pitch and loudness levels, etc. What about the person's language and articulation? What about the way in which a particular gendered identity is enculturated and how a person develops their language in that space? And so there are, and arguably these are very essentialist notions. So some of them are stereotypical notions of male and female socialized language pragmatics. For example, the way in which people articulate, the nature of the articulation, the sounds that are produced, preciseness or not, and other features are all part of what it is that we might want to look at. And I'm just going to dig a little bit more into this. So when you're looking at language, and I'm not just speaking here about how now brown cow or speaking the Queen's English, but literally looking here at the nonverbals as well. So looking at kinesics, so how we use our body, our hands, our head and neck movements, our facial expressions, so the space that we have between people when we communicate. And interesting enough, just a little aside here, this changed so much post-COVID, just because of the rules around social distancing and who could touch people up close and how people use touch as a way to communicate. So haptics, etc., shifted. So I've had to shift my way of thinking around gendered identity and communication that way too. And then, yeah, the use of eyes. So what people do when they speak, how eye movements occur, how we might fix movements when we're talking to people, whether we actually look at people during conversations, etc. Facial expressions are huge. They're all part and parcel of the way we communicate. And of course, match vocal function with that. Sorry, that's not a separate bullet point, it's vocal function exercises. Inflection and phrasing, the kinds of phrases that we use are all gendered in many ways. The sort of words that we choose to use, the descriptors, the adjectives, the inflection in our voices, a whole range of all of those things. And here's where I'm going to land about just reviewing our work now, okay? And does what we do work? Some of the research that's coming up in the literature, in the field, in speech and language therapy, specifically focuses on women and looks at vocal improvement post-therapy. So in fact, in some of these studies that have come up in the last maybe 15 to 20 years, there's not a huge amount of research, show that there's improvement. And in fact, when people get asked to rate their satisfaction with their therapy, with their therapist, but mainly their therapy, almost all are satisfied post-therapy with what they get in the voice that they engage. And but there's lots of work to be done in the field. So we don't know the long-term outcomes. We don't know how well someone's able to use and maintain that voice that we work with. We don't know what we target. So if we go in for a particular approach and targeting, say, resonance voice interactions, is that effective or not? We don't have enough evidence. There's not enough, for example, randomized controlled trials to check that out. And we don't know who's going to make a good candidate for voice therapy. So what works, what doesn't work, who's not going to actually achieve the desired outcomes. We have no set of key prognostic indicators for the work we do, but we do it and we hope, and this is where the increasing evidence base is going to be quite useful because we're hoping to go beyond quasi-experimental studies. It's really hard in speech therapy or in voice when you're working with such diversity to cleanly sanitize the group that you're working with and put them into a randomized control trial. It's virtually impossible. There are lots of methodological limitations with the studies that we do have, so it's not without a fault. So just as a healthcare professional listening to this talk, I'm cautioning you on the nature of the evidence we have and the literature we have, which is great. It's in terms of it's burgeoning, but it's not an excellent evidence base for justifying our clinical decisions, etc. But I think if you speak to anyone in the field, they will, like myself, will just wax lyrical about the things that we can do as speech therapists. The sun shines out of every crevice we own, and we definitely think that our work is important. And yes, we acknowledge that more studies are needed, but we feel what we do is good, and that we enjoy our work. And I'm going to leave you this little reflection point here about gender neutrality, and should it be the goal, right? And I want you to listen to this voice.
Hi, I'm Q, the world's first genderless voice assistant. Think of me like Siri or Alexa, but neither male nor female. I'm created for a future where we are no longer defined by gender, but rather how we define ourselves. My voice was recorded by people who neither identify as male nor female, and then altered to sound gender neutral, putting my voice between 145 and 175 hertz, a range defined by audio researchers. But for me to become a third option for voice assistants, I need your help. Share my voice with Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And together we can ensure that technology recognizes us all. Thanks for listening. Q.
So something to think about in terms of what our targets are, okay? And yeah, I think I think this is my last slide. Yep, voice and communication affirmation for me is very central to gender affirmation. It's critical, it's key, and I'll stand by that. And this is something that it links up back to my first point about accessibility. It's what made me think about putting issues of accessibility here. And while this is relevant to an American audience, if you delete just a little bit about healthcare insurance there, this very recent, it was just published on the 19th of September, article written by Paige Lario speaks about recognizing gender affirmations or gender affirming surgeries and voice training as medical necessities, which, and they're arguing here for health insurance. But if you delete that bit in South Africa, it still makes relevance or is still useful for us to recognize that, like puberty blockers and gender affirming hormones, voice training and voice therapy, these interventions save lives. And so I'm going to leave you with that little thought there, and would love to get any questions or comments. Those are my email addresses if you'd like to connect with me after this talk. So happy to hand back to Alma for any discussion points, etc.